When emotional pain is acute and resources are low, people can be left feeling like there's no way out. Every 90 minutes, somebody dies by suicide in the UK and the Republic of Ireland. The impact reaches families, healthcare and legal systems, the emergency services, and the workplace. In fact, it's estimated that up to 135 people are affected every time somebody dies this way, at a cost of up to £10 billion. So what can business leaders do to ensure that people get the support they need before they reach crisis point? And how can organisations use lived experience to make conversations about suicide and self-harm more open, more human, and more accessible?
You know, it's often a misconception that if you talk to somebody about suicide and are they feeling suicidal, that you might somehow encourage them to act on those feelings. The reality is, 1 in 5 people will have suicidal thoughts in their life.
Sure.
But what that means is, you know, that 4 in 5 may not understand it very much, or may not have come up against it, or may not have experienced it. And actually, it's educative to share those stories. It's such a simple concept. The concept of one human being listening to another human being at the time of crisis in their life. It's so simple, but it's so powerful.
To help us answer some of these questions, I'm joined by Julie Bentley, the CEO of Samaritans, who with nearly 22,000 volunteers across 200 branches, spend nearly 1 million hours a year answering calls for help. They are dedicated to providing a safe space in uncertain times and to achieving a vision that less people die by suicide. Julie, great to see you. How are you doing?
Hello, really pleased to be here.
Yes, likewise. Thank you for putting the time aside on what I'm sure is one of the hottest days in the UK to date this year.
Yeah, it's a little bit warm out there, but we've got some quite ferocious air conditioning actually going on in this building, so I think we'll be all right.
Exactly. It's working hard. It's working hard. Before we get into this, I'd love to hear just a bit more about you, Julie Bentley. 20 years of a track record holding senior leadership positions within organizations focused on a range of causes, including sexual health, homelessness, and children's welfare. Where did your passion for this kind of work start?
So I think it started in my late teens. I was pretty poor academically at school, and was quite shy. But when I was in the sixth form doing A-levels, I became head girl, which was a bit of a fluke, by the way. And as part of that role, you lead quite a lot of charity activities through the year for local charities. And I just really enjoyed it, and it felt really worthwhile. And it made me aware of the work of charities. And I got interested then in charities. So I then began to volunteer as a young person for a range of charities. So I volunteered for Oxfam for a while. I volunteered, and I'm talking quite a long time ago now because I'm 56. So it was around the time when HIV was very much in the news and not the long-term condition we live with now.
Sure.
And I volunteered in an HIV support group where I was a buddy to a woman who was HIV positive. And I just realised that the charity sector, you know, had this real richness to it that was about people and communities and society and contributing something back. And it struck me that if you're going to spend, you know, so many hours of your week every week in a place called work, then actually the charity sector felt like a pretty good place to do it. And so that was that. I trained to be a youth worker, started out as a youth worker.
Sure.
And it went from there.
Amazing. And that's actually something we have in common, being head boy and girl.
Really?
In senior school. Yeah.
Did your headmaster tell you that he was very disappointed that you'd been elected as head boy, and he didn't think that I was going to amount to very much?
Is that really what they said to you?
Yes.
Hence why you think it was a fluke?
I think that, I think that they were hoping for some of their more studious and academic students to get the role, and I definitely wasn't that. So yeah.
So purpose-driven work with people-focused outcomes, and that kind of started with the charity work that you were kind of thrust into as head girl back in senior school, and now today you are leading an organization that is synonymous with crisis support in the UK and dedicated to ensuring that less people die by suicide. So talk to me about the steps between, you know, kind of buddying up with people that were had HIV, your work with Oxfam. How did that kind of progress towards being head of Samaritans?
I think that in my 20s, I kind of moved from frontline work into more leadership roles in the charity sector, and then moved to my first chief executive role of a small organisation when I was 29. And I've been really fortunate to always be able to work in charities that I genuinely had a personal commitment to the cause. So as you say, I've worked in sexual health. I'm somebody who's very passionate about reproductive rights. Young people have been a passion all my life, supporting our next generation. And I was also at Girl Guiding, which was the largest movement of girls and young women, and Action for Children as well, which is about those children who are living really at the margins of society. And for me, Samaritans has always been an organisation that I have supported. So long before I got the privilege of being the CEO here, I was a donor to the organisation.
Sure.
Because my life has been touched by people very dear to me who have struggled with suicidal ideation. And I'd always wanted to be part of Samaritans. And I applied, in fact, to be the chief executive of Samaritans 18 years ago, and didn't even get longlisted. Rightly so, because 18 years ago, I had nowhere near the experience to have this role.
Sure.
So when it came up, and 5 years ago now, it will be, it just felt like that's really where I want to be. The thing about Samaritans is that it's such a simple concept. The concept of one human being listening to another human being at the time of crisis in their life. It's so simple, but it's so powerful. Our volunteers, who are extraordinary people, really do save lives. And it's not very often that you can say that
Sure.
in your role.
In amongst all of that, what would you say is the standout in terms of the standout lesson so far then in terms of that journey?
There's been a lot of lessons, but I think I had to choose one.
Yeah, sure.
The biggest lesson would be the responsibility of leadership. And actually, it's very hard to be a good leader. And one of the things that is very important about being a good leader is to have enormous self-awareness and understand that when you're the leader, however much, and I struggled with this in my early years as a leader, I didn't like thinking I had power. It didn't fit with my very working class kind of, I'm just Julie, and then I realized that actually that was being irresponsible, because whether I like it or not, being a CEO is a position of power.
True.
And actually, it's therefore really important that you recognise and respect that and hold that responsibility really, really thoughtfully. And I think that's probably been one of my biggest lessons.
Love that. Thank you. So as CEO for the last 5 years, you've obviously had some input in terms of the direction for Samaritans, in terms of where the organisation was when you first started and where it's at now, and also where it's going to be going forward. And that has culminated in a particular document. It's called the Samaritan Strategic Priorities 2022 to 2027, based on kind of 5 areas: access, reach, impact, capacity, and sustainability. Access was all about, and quote me if I get this wrong, I'm sure you will, people being able to access our support whenever they need it, and to get it in a way that works for them. And one of the ways that you're going to do this is by expanding digital services such as online chat, self-help apps, and that's because a lot of people find it a lot easier to reach out this way. And it got me thinking just about, I guess, our relationship with technology in this kind of always on, ever connected world. And recently we've had in June, that is, Loneliness Awareness Week. And so I was doing some research for that, and I came across some stats. One of them was from Statistica, and it was talking about the percentage of the world's population that are currently using social media. Care to take a guess?
I would dread to think.
63, according to Statistica, as of 2024, 63.9% of the world's population were social media users. And collectively, across the top 5 social media platforms, I'm sure you can guess who they are, they have in excess of 11 billion monthly active users, with a grand total or an average daily usage of 143 minutes per day.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, with the 143 minutes for sure, because I thought, wow, do I spend anywhere near 2.5 hours scrolling away on my phone? But when I thought about actually what is classed as social media, whether that's YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, etc., actually it might not be the 143, but
Scary how it
yeah,
adds up.
it's scary how it adds up. And just as a personal reflection, I'm probably not as far away from that as I'd like to think. Right?
Yeah.
So 143 minutes a day. And then I saw something else, again, contained in this report of your strategic priorities, saying that actually, your social media posts, Samaritan social media posts, were seen by 100 million times and received 2 million likes, comments, and shares across all platforms. And that you'd also piloted online chat and had over 38,000 conversations. Now, at the same time, as part of my research for Loneliness Awareness Week, I came across a report from the Department for Culture and Sport, and this was the Community Life Survey 2023 to 2024. And it found that in England, around 7% of the population, so that's 3.1 million adults in England, feel lonely often or always. While at the same time, around 10% or 4 million people reported that they either lacked companionship, felt left out, or isolated from others. And so thinking about, the vision of Samaritans, and also the fact that, we know that loneliness in and of itself is a risk factor for self-harm, suicide. I guess the question is, with regards to the strategic priority of access, right? How do you balance the goal of expanding digital services while continuing to celebrate and promote moments of human connection?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the reality is that technology is here.
Yes.
It's not going away, and there is much about it that is really helpful in people's lives. And for Samaritans, the key is about choice for people in how they access our services. But at the heart of Samaritans, it's human to human contact. So at the moment, folks can speak with us via good old fashioned telephone, email, web chat. All of that is with an actual human being at the other end of it.
Sure.
And that won't change. But we also know that increasingly people like to do some information search for themselves. Often people kind of look up a bit about us before they then build up the courage to contact us, because it can take a lot of courage to reach out to Samaritans. And so actually they can get a sense of us as an organisation by looking online and learning more. So for me, I think it is about making sure that there is a balance and options for people who are feeling in crisis about how they access the information and the support that they want. I mean, we know that, in terms of new technologies, there are now, virtual AI therapy bots, etc. And it's not for me to say, of course, they're no good. It's got to be human to human, because for some folk, that might meet their needs. But what's very important is that we don't just get to the place where we think technology is the one answer for everybody, because it never will be. But we do know, for example, that at different points in people's journeys, different things work. So interestingly, during COVID, during lockdown, what we found was a decline in people phoning us and an increase in people emailing us. And that was because everybody was stuck at home together. It was more difficult to have a private phone call to Samaritans. But of course, you could send a private email because people couldn't overhear you sending an email. Since we launched the pilot of web chat, what we've seen there is the demographic of people who are contacting us via web chat is different to the demographic of people that contact us by telephone. And that's good. And what we know is that actually a very high proportion of the folks who now contact us via web chat didn't ever contact us before because they didn't want to reach out to us by phone or email. So that creation of a new channel has enabled more people who need our service to access it. And that's the point of, the access strand of the strategy. It's entirely about how do we ensure that the folk who need us, the folk who are in crisis, can get to us in the way they want to get to us.
I love that. Yeah. And yeah, particularly interesting you talk about, I guess, providing more options for people to feel supported before mental health becomes an issue, before they reach crisis point, and do it on terms that meet their needs. I think really, really important. Interesting as well, you mentioned about, different demographics and how for some people the web chat was actually the first time they were reaching out for one reason or another, COVID being an example. And also, just speaking on this point of demographics, that makes me think about the next strategic priority, which was reach. And that, just to give people context, that was about being more visible and relevant, particularly to a more diverse range of people and communities, so that those who might need us most trust and know we are there for them. And you want to do that by reaching people whose circumstances mean that they have a high risk of suicide, such as those living in deprivation or those who are marginalized. And so it got me thinking about the link between socioeconomic status and, mental health outcomes for different parts of the community. As you may be aware, the theme for Mental Health Awareness Week this year, back in the middle of May now, not April, May, was all about community. And so some of the research I did for that was just about exploring, different mental health outcomes for different parts of the community. And what I found was that actually out of nearly 53,000 people detained under the Mental Health Act between 2023 and 2024, 8,254, or nearly 16%, were from the most deprived communities. In addition to that, people among the poorest 10% of society are more than twice as likely to die by suicide compared with the 10% wealthiest of society. So, thoughts on those numbers?
It is the fact that suicide is an equality issue. As you say, the data speaks for itself. Those folk who are in the most deprived percentages of our society have a much heightened risk to suicide than those people who are living in the top echelons of our society. And we also know that people that face other disadvantages, such as folk who live with disabilities, are more likely to be at risk of poor mental health, suicidality, etc. People who live with autism, for example. So we know that for people who are in groups that are already disadvantaged, that there is a double whammy, if you like, of layers. And because, of course, what we also understand is that, it isn't singular, is it? So, you might have somebody, for example, who is, living, in economic hardship, who is also living with a disability. So it's multi-layered. But we know that these societal factors are some of the factors that contribute to suicidal feelings. It's important to say that suicide is very complex, and there isn't any one thing that leads somebody to have suicidal thoughts.
No.
And people who are in more privileged lifestyles do also have suicidal thoughts.
Sure.
But statistically, we know that there is an added disadvantage for many of the people that are already living with unacceptable levels of disadvantage.
Yeah, well said. And what do you think is the role, or what do you think the role of employers can be in helping to limit the impact of things like a person's socioeconomic background on outcomes related to their mental health, including but not limited to suicidal ideation?
Yeah. In terms of the employer?
Yes.
So I think that, increasingly as employers, and obviously Samaritans is an employer as well,
Yes.
we have to be understanding the world that both our organisation or business is operating in and the world that our people are operating in. So, across the board, we're seeing in this country, increased levels of anxiety in the workplace. We're seeing people struggling more in the workplace, being burnt out in the workplace. We're hearing this at a level that 20 years ago we just weren't hearing that. And I think that that's a combination of factors where some of those factors are actually, it's just pretty tough out there at the moment for people. And people's expectations of the relationship with their employer is different. So my sense is that as employers, we need to understand and accept that, our folk that work with us, they are people, they're rounded human beings, and they don't park huge parts of themselves at the door when they come to work. They hopefully feel able to bring all of themselves to the workplace. And that means our job as employers is to understand that, to recognise that, to create a culture where, yes, we have expectations of one another, all of us of one another, but we also want to create an environment where, whilst you might be here to work, to do a job, we want you to be comfortable, we want you to feel at ease, we want you to feel like you can be your authentic self. So creating a culture where people can do that, making sure that there are support mechanisms in place for folk if they are struggling. And that might be internal or external. So, for example, in Samaritans, we have mental health first aiders, we have employer assistance programs. Also, we have for some of our colleagues who work in particular roles, access to external therapeutic support individually and in groups, because some of the, as you might imagine, working in a charity that's focused around suicide, some of the content can be very difficult.
Yes.
And so we provide therapeutic support to those folks who need that. But there's something for me also about for an employer to create an atmosphere that is likely to ensure the well-being of their people as best as any employer can do. It's about having really open communication, being honest with your workforce. Businesses are struggling. Businesses are finding things very difficult. It's very easy if you're leading an organisation, I think, to get very focused on, keeping the ship on the road business-wise. And then you can lose some stuff. You can the other stuff that feels maybe nice to have, well-being of people and, staff forums and bringing people together. But actually, my view would be that our job as leaders is, of course, to run your organisation and your business properly, but you need your people to be at their best, to feel at their best. And so holding both of those things. And in Samaritans, we have a monthly meeting for all staff, virtual meeting for all staff, because our staff are all over the UK.
Sure.
And Ireland. And we have regular updates, for example, on our business planning and on our financial situation. And sometimes that means sharing really difficult news. But the philosophy is we're going to treat our colleagues as grown-ups, and we're going to be honest with them about the things that are going well and the things that are a challenge, so that people have information and feel like they're being openly communicated with.
Yeah, driving that sense of belonging. So communication, openness, transparency, and again, more options for people to bring their whole selves to work and feel supported, both internally and externally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And again, just coming back to this question of demographics and I guess different segments of society that are affected by poor mental health outcomes. In this case, we're talking about suicide. There is a stat that's been prevalent, since 2010, and that is that, middle-aged men aged 45 to 64 have had the highest rates of suicide. So to a lot of people watching, that won't come as any surprise. I guess my question is, if there was one kind of cultural or workplace shift or adjustment that you feel could move the dial on men's mental health, what would that be?
Well, if I could only have one, I think it would be shifting the dial on what is understood to be acceptable for men to think, feel and say. So I feel, unfortunately, and the numbers sadly bear this out, we still, I think, have a societal oppression almost of men being able to say out loud, I'm not actually doing so well.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I even think for some men, they don't even let themselves think it.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't good for anybody to try and drive down very difficult, dark feelings and thoughts and feelings of not being able to cope. We need to be able to express these feelings. We need to be able to talk about suicidality. It's often a misconception that if you talk to somebody about suicide and are they feeling suicidal, that you might somehow encourage them to act on those feelings. Whereas the opposite is true, of course. Actually, creating a space, a safe, normal space where you can openly talk about suicide is actually a protective factor. And so we need to get to a place where more men, and some men are able to do this, but more men feel able to say, I'm not all right, to talk about their feelings with one another. And so we do quite a lot of work to try and reach out to men. We work with in workplace employers that are traditionally more male, such as construction industry, for example.
Sure.
We've done partnerships with things like Norwich Football Club, where we've done campaigns around encouraging men to open up and talk in the workplace. I think that it's very powerful hearing real stories, and it's very powerful when colleagues share with other colleagues their stories, especially if men do that. Actually talk about, do you know what, I went through a period of finding things really, really difficult, or actually I live with suicidal thoughts, and this is how I navigate that and handle that. We've got to break down this, enduring and, dangerous, actually, cultural issue, which is, men don't talk about feelings, because men are just as capable of talking about their feelings as women are. They need permission to do that. And actually, it's such an act of courage to do that, that I think we need to reframe it as, it's certainly not weak to talk about difficult feelings. It's actually a really, really brave thing to do, to talk about difficult feelings.
And I love the idea of, creating more opportunities for people to kind of share their own story. Oftentimes, it's a lot easier to connect with the vulnerability in yourself once you can reflect on it through the medium of another person.
Absolutely. And sometimes a call to Samaritans is the kind of the thing that pulls back the curtain on that. We have a story. We use storytelling quite often in Samaritans, and there's a wonderful case study of a chap who is a firefighter, and he was having suicidal thoughts and actually was very actively considering taking his life, and something just made him ring Samaritans, and for the first time he was able to just say everything, because one of the beautiful things about Samaritans is it's freeing, because people often don't speak because they're worried about hurting somebody they love, or upsetting close friends, or worrying people close to them, because they've got invested relationships. If you call us at Samaritans, you don't know the person, you know that they're not invested in anything other than listening to you and being there.
Sure.
And it can create an extraordinary space where people can talk about feelings they've never spoken about before. And in this particular case study, he talks about making that call and having those conversations for the first time, and as a result of that, then being able to go back to his family and friends and feeling able to say to them, actually, I'm in a difficult place, I need some help here.
Powerful.
So that's really powerful, I think.
Yeah, thank you. How can organizations, workplaces use a similar approach to make conversations about this subject more accessible?
Yeah, I would really encourage employers to bring lived experience into their organisations. In Samaritans, actually, our lived experience research panel is at 650 people now, and we work hard. We're not perfect. We haven't got it completely right yet, but we work hard to have lived experience within Samaritans. So we have folk, for example, with lived experience represented on our different committees, our advisory groups, our board of trustees, to try and make sure it's kind of really embedded into the fabric of how we do things in the organisation. But again, my advice to other employers would be, don't be afraid for people to talk about these issues. The reality is, 1 in 5 people will have suicidal thoughts in their life.
Sure.
But what that means is, that 4 in 5 may not understand it very much, or may not have come up against it, or may not have experienced it. And actually, it's educative to share those stories. But mainly, it's about creating a culture of openness and permission to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Is there a risk where that's concerned in terms of people maybe oversharing in the workplace?
Yeah.
And how would you kind of guide employers, leaders, managers to manage that,
Yeah.
to make sure that the conversation is being had, but it's been had in a way that's, like you say, educative, productive, informative.
It has to have boundaries, of course.
Yeah.
You know, the reality is people come to work, they're paid to do a job.
Yes.
That's needed. Um, but, for example, I think the boundaries and the containment are in the support that you put in place. So, for example, mental health first aiders within the workplace, peer-to-peer support, or an employer assistance program, where if somebody, you know, is really struggling, they can access the employer assistance program, which is an independent and confidential service, but it's accessed through the workplace. But the reason you need to have the open culture is because if there isn't that in the first place, people won't feel able to come forward to say, I actually think I need to access our EAP scheme, or I think I need a conversation with one of our mental health first aiders, you know. So it's not that the employer has to provide everything itself to its workforce, but it's about creating a culture and a framework where people can be appropriately signposted, that they feel able to say, can I go, I need a bit of help here.
Sure.
And the employer is ready to respond, not by doing it all themselves necessarily, but by having the tools and the systems in place.
Yeah, it's like almost a chicken and egg conversation, but ultimately you can't put the brakes on something you've got no momentum with. You need those, like you say, frameworks in place in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay. And that brings me actually to the passing of the Online Safety Act 2023, which I believe you had some part in. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, the Online Safety Bill, which sought to make online environments much safer across a myriad of issues, but obviously access to suicide information online is a very real problem.
Yes.
And it's a problem on large platforms, but also on smaller platforms. We worked really hard to try to influence the bill, and we were very pleased to see all the different protections put in relation to children. We do feel that a real trick was missed, to be honest, because it doesn't extend to adults. And so adults don't have the same protections within that bill as children. And you might say, well, you know, an adult should be able to work it out for themselves. But, you know, you don't suddenly switch the minute you turn 18 years old from a vulnerable person, a vulnerable young person, to a vulnerable adult. Sometimes you stay that vulnerable person.
Sure.
And actually, at the moment, there continues to be, and even with the bill, will continue to be, because it didn't go far enough, far too much harmful content online. We call it legal but harmful, because it might not necessarily be illegal within the bill, but it's still very harmful. So, for example, you know, talking about access to means, for example. So it's important, I think, to also say the online environment can be a very helpful and supportive place to people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts. And that's good, and we wouldn't want that to stop. But at the moment, there are continuing to be too many platforms that have unsafe content on them. And it is a real challenge, because many of them are hosted overseas. And also, you know, many of them, you close them down in one form and they can just pop up again in another form. So it's a bit like whack-a-mole. It's quite difficult to deal with. So we think progress has been made in terms of online safety, but we think there's still more that could be done.
What else would you say are some of the other kind of big challenges when it comes to delivering a suicide-safer internet?
I mean, obviously the prevalence of it, obviously the accuracy or not of information. In terms of some vulnerable folk, not just children, people knowing what people are actually accessing. Some sites propose or present themselves as being supportive spaces, but actually they're not. They're very...
It's the opposite.
They're very dangerous places, because they actually actively encourage people to take action around their suicidal thoughts. So I think there's that, the ability to discern in the huge amount of information there is in an online space. And also, of course, in online spaces now, we know that, you know, as I said, there's lots of good stuff, but we also know that there are lots of people seeking to influence people in myriad ways. And it can be very difficult to discern and navigate your way safely through that.
Yeah.
But that's why it is important that actually we do as much as we can to highlight great support places online, but also to continue to draw attention to sites that are not good. But you have to be careful in how you draw attention to sites as well, of course, because you don't want to give oxygen, as it were, to sites that you wouldn't want people to be accessing.
So speaking of this myriad of information that's now available, and the multitude of ways that people can access it, what role do you feel that artificial intelligence, AI, plays in this journey of delivering a safer internet?
Well, I think, AI is here and it's not going away. So that's the first thing. And I think that there are real risks, but there are real opportunities as well with AI. I mean, we certainly are exploring, what does it mean for Samaritans? We're really clear that it doesn't mean that Samaritans would ever be delivered by AI bots. Samaritans will continue to be humans there to listen. But actually, how can we use AI in the background to help improve our service? To do moderation, AI could be used to identify, in written word correspondence, when people are at a particular point of crisis who might need help sooner, so triaging calls, etc. So I think, it's still too early for us to really understand fully around AI, and we need to be very cautious about it, but we also need to be willing to embrace it. I think, as I said earlier, we are already seeing, the development of AI chatbots, of AI, therapeutic prevention, therapeutic support. We are indeed in some other countries at least seeing the development of AI robots to support loneliness, people around loneliness. I mean, kind of blows my mind on some levels, to be honest with you, and terrifies me on some levels. But I'm trying to keep an open mind, because I think, if it can be proven that some of these AI solutions do actually support people who are lonely and isolated, then great. But we just need to make sure that the right safeguards are in place around that. But I really hope it doesn't mean that we're moving toward a world where we don't value and recognise the inherent crucial nature of maintaining human-to-human contact. Because I think when all else is said and done, that two people being able to talk to one another will always have something that no AI can ever have.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that, I definitely think it's about thinking of the way that AI can be used to enhance human connection,
add value,
as opposed to get us to a position where we think, actually, what do we need that for? Which hopefully that doesn't become the case. So yeah, like you say, right safeguards in place, and look for a way to make it work for us.
Yeah.
As opposed to the other way around.
Exactly.
So the other thing I wanted to kind of talk about from the manifesto was this part where it says that everybody with a mental health care plan receives financial support and advice. And the backdrop to this is that Samaritans volunteers currently answer over 400 calls for help per day on average from people who are worried about money or work. And actually in June 2023, almost 1 in 10 first-time calls to Samaritans were about finance or unemployment concerns. So clearly a link between money and mental health, and the impact is we spoke about earlier in terms of people from more deprived socioeconomic backgrounds and the outcomes for them. So I guess the question here is, what can employers do to help people understand the link between money and mental health?
Yes, so there certainly is a link. Financial concerns about finances or financial hardship can be a contributory factor to suicidal feelings. And I think that often an employer might think, my responsibility to an employer in terms of finances and money is to, how much I pay them. But it isn't just about that. So, in Samaritans, one of the things that we did last year was when we were trying to help our staff understand how the organisation is funded and financed, because we were experiencing financial challenges like many charities. And we realised that actually, because we talk about budgets all the time, we started off just telling people about the budget presentation, and then we realised that actually people weren't understanding what that meant.
Didn't connect.
So then we offered our staff drop-in sessions with my colleague Graham, who heads up finance. Say, do you want to understand about budgets in organisations like ours and how it works, and just like get down to the nitty-gritty, to just like demystify it all.
Yes.
And that might sound like, what's that got to do with employees? But actually, it helps employees understand how the organisation that employs them earns its money, brings in its money, where its money has to be spent. It's all more empowering to understand that stuff. And it then helps staff understand the contexts around their own benefit and reward package. But I think often benefits to our staff, some of the things that are most valued are actually those things like advice and guidance and support and access to materials like that. So I think employers shouldn't be afraid to think about what they can provide, and not get kind of fixated on it's always got to be about pay. That there are other things that people value as well.
Yeah, and also can they afford not to?
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess the theme there is that we're looking for ways to keep the conversation, which in many ways is still really taboo to talk about. If talking about suicidal ideation is taboo or has a lot of stigma, well, talking about your finances, I think is up there as well. So thinking about different ways that we can kind of keep that conversation open, accessible, and just kind of top of mind for people. And I think there's almost a theme there from something we spoke about earlier in terms of people just being able to kind of, once something is top of mind, then being in a position to actually reflect on their own circumstances through the medium of a proxy. In this case, in Samaritans, it's the business, and actually getting an idea of, well, how does money work in the business? How does that relate to myself? Exactly. What benefits have I got available?
Yeah,
I like that. I also wanted to talk about the economic cost of suicide as well, and that's because it's actually again another report of yours. You do a lot of this. So it says here that you worked with the London School of Economics to work out actually how much suicide costs to society. And actually these figures were the first ones published on the cost of suicide in over a decade. And some of the kind of takeaways here were that it's actually estimated that 135 people are affected every time somebody takes their own life. And based on the 6,588 deaths that were registered by suicide or recorded in 2022, that means nearly 900,000 people a year could be affected across the UK. With an overall cost of at least £9.58 billion. And so that impact is felt across sectors such as legal, healthcare, emergency services, and also the families that are left behind. But very specifically, just thinking about how this impacts the workplace, that's measured by something called employment productivity loss. And the total employment productivity losses for people of all ages was nearly 2.5 billion. So around 25% of that, that earlier figure. So what stands out to you as the most urgent challenges, with that figure in mind, what stands out to you as the most urgent challenge or challenges that businesses face when it comes to suicide prevention?
In the workplace, again, often employers think about suicide as a personal thing that's outside of work. Mm-hmm. And there's, it doesn't really belong in here. But if you have colleagues or employees who struggle with suicidal feelings or are in emotional crisis, mm-hmm. they don't leave that part of themselves outside the door when they come to work. They bring that they can't not. And I think it's that awareness and sensitivity to that. And again, it's not about solving people's problems for them, but it's about having an organisational culture and having processes and systems and support in place that people can access if they want to. And again, that sharing of experience, as I said earlier, from leaders particularly in their workplace about their own struggles. It's extraordinarily powerful when a leader shares something about themselves. And I see this all the time in very different examples, so I'm dyslexic. So not long after I started, I said to colleagues, I'm dyslexic. So just so you know, this is how I process information and this is what I'll struggle with. If you try and, come in a meeting with me and then just present me with 25 very detailed PowerPoint slides and ask me for my opinion, you're not going to get one because I need different time to process.
Sure.
And I also talk often, openly about I was pretty rubbish at school academically and didn't do very well. And people, it's always amazing how people say, it's really great hearing you say that, actually, because it kind of makes it all right. I struggle with dyslexia, or actually I find that difficult. It's something about creating permission. And so I think any employer can do that. Mm-hmm. But, and we might go on to this.
Go on.
Actually, if we are going to really tackle suicide, we need to do it for the individuals. We need to do it for those 135 and myriad other people where the ripple effect of suicide affects people. And, it's not just that individual whose talent and skill and productivity is lost from society. Very often the folk around those people, it impacts their life, irreparably. They often can't work either as a result of that. And indeed, if you're bereaved by suicide, that increases your risk of potentially feeling suicidal yourself. But it's a huge societal issue, and therefore we need a societal response to that.
Off the back of that, how important would you say, things like mental health first aid training or suicide prevention training is for managers and HR teams with all of that in mind?
I think it's very, very important. Mental health first aids in the workplace, I think, are absolutely essential. But we know that if we equip people to understand the signs around suicide, but also we equip people to just have the conversation. So we run a campaign every few years recently called Small Talk Saves Lives. And the premise of it is, it doesn't take a lot to reach out to somebody else. And when you have those moments where you're with somebody or you see somebody and you think, I get the feeling they're not all right. How often do we actually think it, but pass on by, versus actually saying to that person, hiya. And the Small Talk Saves Life premise is, you don't need to even say, hello, you look like you're a bit down, are you all right? You can use anything that just taps into them and gets them reconnected back to another human being. And actually that skill is so important. We have a partnership with Network Rail, and we've trained thousands of Network Rail staff over the years to be able to, one, recognise those signs, and two, have those small talk conversations on train platforms and in train carriages, etc. A number of railway staff have actually, saved the life of people who have been at the station feeling like they might want to take their life. So I think anybody can talk about this. It's just having the courage and the confidence and the knowledge and skill of what to say, but it's actually really simple.
Yeah. So it's knowledge and skill, which is where kind of accredited training like mental health first aid might come into it. But actually, like you say, anybody can start a conversation. As per the campaign name, Small Talk Saves Lives, and that was going to be a question actually, just around what is one thing that all businesses can do, regardless of budget. Because not all businesses are in the same position in terms of being able to, shell out for training, etc. But regardless of budget, that can kind of, contribute to this vision that less people die by suicide. And I think you've summed it up really well there. Small talk saves lives. It's those small moments of connection that can make a really big difference. Yeah. So we've covered some of the aims of Samaritans over the 5 years, covering sort of 2022 to 2027. What does success look like at the end of the decade?
Success in terms of our vision, that fewer people die by suicide, would of course be a considerably lower deaths of suicide in this country.
Sure.
Ideally the lowest ever. We're not going to get there on our own, though. Samaritans can't make that happen on our own. The only way we're going to get there is if we have, and we're not going to get there by the end of the decade, but if that's our aim, we're only going to get there if we actually have a concerted approach that is bringing together the public, private and not-for-profit sector, working together, and really understanding the root causes of suicidality and addressing those. And that is a real challenge, because actually, we live in a bit of a society that's a bit of a sticking plaster approach. But to address the root causes of suicide, we've already named some of them. Disadvantage, prejudice, poverty. We aren't going to eradicate those things overnight, and certainly Samaritans is not going to eradicate them on their own. That's why we've got to, to see real systems change around this. It's got to be a concerted approach that's led by government, but that brings together those different stakeholder groups and does away with the silos and seeks ways to join it up. As I said, we have people falling through the net because at the moment they're accessing the system in all these different points, and we're not scooping them up and getting hold of them and dealing with them as that whole person. We've got to find a way of doing that.
Understood. And what would you say is the best way for somebody to get on board, get involved in helping us achieve this vision, that less people die by suicide, even if, let's say, getting on the phones isn't for them?
Well, you can volunteer with Samaritans and not be a listener. So we have volunteers who we call listening volunteers, who are the people that deliver the listening service. But we have lots of other volunteers that are in really important support roles. So you could be involved with Samaritans and, do some of our promotion work or our outreach work or our policy and influencing work. It's the policy and influencing work is a big part of what we do. If we know the system needs to change, then we need to keep talking to people about that. There's a myriad of ways you can get involved.
Would that include the lived experience panel as well?
Yep, absolutely. If you have lived experience, obviously you could get in touch with us to join the lived experience panel, or indeed you might not want to be on the lived experience panel, but you might want to, be engaged in a one-off thing, giving them some advice about a recent campaign, a new campaign or whatever. So check out the website. We'd love to have you on board.
Excellent. Julie, it has been an absolute pleasure catching up. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
It's been a real pleasure to talk to you as well.
Cheers. This has been Wellbeing Talk with myself, Matt Balfour, your guide to more accessible conversations about mental health in the workplace. Be sure to subscribe to the Let's Go Wellbeing YouTube channel and we'll connect on the next episode.